Joining us now to talk a little bit more about the verdict is criminal defense attorney Elmira Yousufi. Good to see you, Elmira. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you so much for having me.
What do we talk about? He was acquitted on racketeering conspiracy and sex trafficking. Can you just briefly talk about those and why the jury found him not guilty of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So the most serious charges were the RICO charges and the sex trafficking charges. Originally yesterday, the jury had come to a unanimous vote on 4 of the counts, but did not on the RICO charge. And the judge basically said, go back and come up with a unanimous verdict. And then this morning, after only an hour, they came up with the verdict. So my theory is that there were definitely some jurors who thought he was absolutely guilty and some who did not. And I think ultimately they did not want to deliberate any longer. Okay. And so the individuals who were adamant about his guilty verdict decided to switch sides. And I do believe that's why they came up with a not guilty verdict.
Okay.
As for the sex trafficking, ultimately I think they had a problem with the witnesses testifying to being involved in the freak-offs. Sure. and essentially appearing as if they were consenting to it and not being forced or coerced.
So guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. That basically sounds like you hire a prostitute in one state and you transport them to another state to engage in prostitution. Is that essentially what it is?
Very straightforward, exactly, yeah. Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about that. He seemed to be somewhat celebratory because he was acquitted of the more serious charges. This is 10 years for each count. What do you think he might get, and what will the judge look at?
Yeah, so the maximum sentence for that particular count is 10 years. It is highly, highly unlikely that he is going to get the maximum sentence simply because this is his first conviction. And so he's going to be looked at as someone with no prior criminal history. He's someone in his 50s. So those are going to be mitigating factors for him, which kind of takes him out of that maximum sentence category. What typically happens at this stage is he goes through similar to like a probation type of department where they do an interview and they look at mitigating and aggravating factors. And they follow what's known as the federal sentencing guidelines. Mm-hmm. And it's basically a point system that's a little bit too complicated to talk about. But based on that, they're going to have a recommendation for the court. And then the prosecution is going to have their own argument as to what the sentence could be.
Can the judge look at the fact that he beat up Cassie there? We saw the video. Can the judge look at kind of anything, even if it has nothing to do with transporting somebody to engage in prostitution?
Yes, and that is exactly what the judge will do. He will consider everything he heard during the jury trial and everything that wasn't heard in front of the jury, because as we know, during the jury trial, there are some moments where the jury doesn't hear what's going on. There's sidebars between the attorneys and the judge. So the judge has a lot more information than the jury does. Okay. And he'll be able to consider everything he knows.
Anything's fair game, is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
The bail was denied. Why do you think that happened, and were you surprised or not?
I personally was not surprised because he is no longer He no longer has the presumption of innocence. He's now been found guilty of a crime, whereas bail usually is when you're arguing before somebody has been sentenced because they have the presumption of innocence. Yeah. Now, we did get rid of the most serious charges, the RICO charge and the sex trafficking, but I mean, his sentencing is in a couple months, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense for him to be released on bail just to come back and then go back into custody, because I do believe that the judge is going to sentence him to some sort of prison sentence.
Was it this history of violence that maybe the judge looked at and said, I'm not going to release you?
I do believe the judge indicated that he was denying the bail due to the propensity of violence that he did see during this jury trial. But I also do believe it just doesn't make a lot of logical sense because, again, he will come back for sentencing and very likely will be sentenced back into custody.
We'll see. Elmira Yousufi, good to see you. Thanks for providing some insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
What happens.